Hi, everybody. Before we get to another great interview, and I've got a really good one for you today if you're a lover of fantasy. It's going to be so good. But before we get to that, if you could help us out by subscribing, we'd really appreciate it. Now let's get to that interview. Hi, everybody. Welcome to another edition of Too Opinionated. I'm so excited today. You know, I'm a big fantasy lover. I've got author David Allen Schlaefer with me. So welcome, David.
Hey, so nice to be here. I'm glad you had me on.
Yeah, I was really excited to talk with you. I think this is such a neat series and a unique way of kind of getting into the fantasy genre. So I want to get into the books, but before we do, tell me a little bit about yourself, because I think you've got such a unique backstory. You know, tell me a little about yourself and how you got into writing.
Absolutely. So I am a Foreign Service officer. I'm an American diplomat. I've been in the Foreign Service quite a long time at this point, almost 30 years, almost 3 decades. And in that time, I have lived, as you can imagine, all over the world. Started off in Latin America. I was in Brazil and Mexico. I have served in Japan, a very long stint in Tokyo. I've served in Iraq in the Middle East and was attached to the 3rd Brigade Combat Team in Iraq. I have served in Romania. I'm currently assigned to the U.S. Embassy in Kiev in Ukraine. I'm only back here in the States for a short period. Of course, we have pulled out of Kiev and we've been operating along the Polish border. And I served in Finland. And that, of course, is what informed the fantasy series. And one of the reasons that I got into Finnish myth and folklore so much. But, you know, I've really always been into writing ever since I was a kid. I grew up down in South Texas, right at the border with Mexico, about as far away from Finland as you can imagine, 100 degrees every day, and it's a tropical area. Back then in the 80s, etc., that was still a pretty isolated area. And this is, pre-internet, you're kind of cut off down there. And so I think that reading and writing was kind of my way of interacting, with the world and with the larger world and feeling a part of it, and kind of my escape when I was a little kid in particular, and living out on a farm in South Texas. And so that love of writing and wanting to produce something like the Far Northern Land, I think, has always been with me. Written lots of articles and lots of short stories and stuff like that. But this series was the first time that I had an opportunity to really, over a long period of time, when I wrote this, if you can believe it, over a course of 7 years, I did all 3 books back to back, didn't stop. It was my first opportunity to really do something like that. And it was a real labor of love, I think.
Yeah, that's so terrific. What was the city in Texas that you grew up in?
So McAllen, Texas. It's down in the Rio Grande Valley. Yep. If you've ever heard of McAllen, it's close to Brownsville, down in that area.
Is that near Far?
It is. It's side by side, adjacent to Far. So Far and McAllen are. Yep.
I worked for about a decade for DirecTV, and they have a call center in Far, Texas. So I've been out there a few times, and I think that's down. You're in the area of what's the little island you have down there? It's
South Padre Island.
That's it.
Absolutely.
South Padre Island. Padre. So they used to have their conferences down there. Beautiful. Yeah, it's really really nice. So I actually know that area just a little bit. But you're right. It's kind of isolated. There's not a ton down there. Yeah, I thought that's maybe where you were. Is, yeah, and they
especially back then.
Well, yeah, I can imagine. And this, when I was down there, it's probably the early 2000s. But we used to they take us across the border briefly for like dinner or something. But we just a couple hours over and then right back. But that's really terrific. any thoughts on the situation going on with the Ukraine? I mean, were you in a, did it, was that occurring before you got to the Polish area, or did you guys get out ahead of that?
Yeah, so we got out ahead of that. I was actually one of the last officials to leave our embassy in Kiev, and that was about, I want to say about 10 days maybe before the invasion
Yeah.
started. Although at that point, we obviously had very clear indications that something was going to happen.
Yeah.
I don't think anyone knew it was going to be a full-scale invasion, but we certainly knew that something was going to probably occur. It was a really surreal experience. I drove across the entire length of Ukraine in my car, in my POV, my personally owned vehicle, as the jargon goes in the military. We were briefly in Western Ukraine and in a city, Lviv. And
Yeah.
when you see the news footage now, that's where most of the reporters are. You'll see LVIV, Lviv, down as the city that all the international journalists are in. And then we pulled across the Polish border more or less about the time when the conflict began. And we've been operating there ever since.
Yeah. Yeah. When we grew up through the 80s and the 90s, you didn't have the coverage and the access that you have now to what is actually occurring. And I know we're still missing quite a bit of it, but it's surreal is a good way to put it, because it's hard to believe that that's happening over there. And I keep thinking of however it turns out, just the destruction and having to rebuild over there is going to just take years.
It really will. It's a terrible tragedy. I think some of the scenes I saw really looked like something from 1945,
Yeah.
tens of thousands of refugees pouring across the border. One of the most surreal things for me personally is that in the position that I have there is the senior assistance coordinator. And so I travel quite a bit through the country, and the cities that are really being hammered right now, Mariupol, which is that city that is surrounded right on the coast, and Kharkiv, which is where this new Russian offensive is about to start in just a couple of days, probably. I was there in October and November. And to see the images now, to see the pictures now, Mariupol looks like Stalingrad. It's just absolutely destroyed. The Ukrainian defenders are isolated in these pockets now around the city. Kharkiv is just hit on a daily basis with missiles and with shelling, just like it was in the Second World War when the Germans took it. It is shocking. It is sad. It's an absolute tragedy. I think the only positive thing about it is that no one could have known, except for the Ukrainians, that they would be able to resist the way that they have, and to fight back and to defend their country in the spirit that they have shown and the success that they have had in the face of this overwhelming Russian firepower. It's an amazing story. And I think we're all really heartened by that. I think it's too early to declare victory, so to speak. We still have to see what happens with the fighting in the east, and I think there are still going to be some very difficult days ahead for the Ukrainians as the Russians gear up for phase 2 of the conflict. But I'm really confident that regardless of the challenges, Ukraine is going to be able to overcome this. What they have shown to the whole world, I think, is just it's really amazing. And I know we're all, our thoughts are with them, obviously, constantly. And the whole international community is behind them. And the U.S. certainly is committed to doing whatever we can do to help Ukraine.
Yeah. It's been pretty incredible, just the cooperation, kind of worldwide that we're seeing to kind of help. Just a terrible situation. In your role there on the border, are you helping with refugees? What do you help with there?
Yeah, exactly. So a little bit of everything, especially in the early days and in the immediate days right after, when it looked like the Russians were just going to come down and, take Kiev
Right.
maybe in a few days. So I was working with the refugee population and the refugee flows that were coming across. I was working with some international organizations. I'll give you a good concrete example, a thing called World Central Kitchen, which
Yeah.
provides meals and portable food trucks and stuff like that. I worked to broker an agreement between the Polish border authorities and the Ukrainian border guards to allow World Central Kitchen to get through in a special lane to set up their food trucks right there where all these lines of, some days 40, 50,000 people, waiting to get across so that they could be fed, etc. And multiply that by whatever 100. That's the type of stuff that my colleagues and I were doing on a daily basis, mainly just trying to get humanitarian aid and humanitarian assistance across to Ukrainians, both at the border and then to try to get that further into the country too, right? To get it to Kiev, to get it to other places that were being affected.
Yeah, yeah, that's such terrific work and good for you, but yeah, difficult, very difficult. I'm glad you got out ahead of it. That yeah, stuff we're
Yeah,
seeing out there just really scary, with that, and
it is.
it's stuff that you read about growing up. Never thought that we would see that on that scale again.
Exactly.
Yeah, it's kind of crazy. So okay, so let's talk a little bit happier subject. So
Okay.
tell me,
Yeah.
so you were in Finland. Is that where while you were there? Is that where you kind of got the love of the the Finnish myths and some of the folklore, or were you a fan of that before you got there?
So it's a good question. It's a little bit of both, actually.
Okay.
So when I was a kid, my living down in McAllen and everything, my parents had some books that were part of these, and you may remember these back then. There would be these Time Life series and
Oh yeah.
Reader's Digest series of like mysteries of the world, right? And
Yeah.
these kind of things, just those big hard volumes, and it would have all this stuff in there. And one of them that they had was called A Folklore of the World. And so when I was, who knows, 5 years old, 6 years old, just when I was starting to read and starting to get interested in things and being a little more aware, I started reading that book, Folklore of the World. And there was a little section in there, 3 pages, and I can see it in my mind's eye as if it was yesterday, all the pictures and everything about the Kalevala. Okay, and the
Yeah.
Kalevala, that's the name of the Finnish national, myth, they call it. It's this collection of, they were chanted poems, basically poems, but they were meant to be sung. They were meant to be chanted, that had been put together in the 19th century, written down in the 19th century for the first time. And all of these collected, Finnish folk tales and legends, probably over the course of 1,000 years, had been passed down in an oral tradition. That is when I first saw that and read about that. And so I learned about these characters, kind of the Finnish equivalent of the Norse, characters. We all
Right.
know Odin and Loki and Thor. So, Finnish, completely separate language group. The people came from the Russian steppes. Characters like Vainamoinen, who is the great shaman and wizard in Finnish mythology, and was one of J.R.R. Tolkien's sources for both Gandalf
Yeah.
and Tom Bombadil, actually, for both of those characters. Lemminkäinen, the name of this second book that just came out, The Heir of Lemminkäinen, he's another one of the heroes. That's where I learned about this for the first time. Even before I read The Hobbit or The Lord of the Rings, or even knew about the impact that both the Finnish language and these same stories had on J.R.R. Tolkien. I didn't even know who J.R.R. Tolkien was at that point. So that's where I learned about it. But then you hit the nail on the head when I had an opportunity to go to Helsinki and live there for 4 years, almost 5 years, and even before that to study Finnish. I really started to get into it. I joined the Kalevala Society in Helsinki, and went to just everything that I could go to immerse myself in that and dig deeper, and really try to get a better understanding of it. And that is when this idea really began to form, that I wanted to do something to bring that world to life for non-Finnish speakers, since so few people in the States and the English speaking world, or outside of Finland really, know what the Kalevala is, have access to that. I wanted to do something that would bring that to a new generation of fantasy readers, since I love fantasy literature so much. And that's how the idea started to take shape, and that's how the Far Northern Land Saga, this trilogy, came about.
Yeah, I really love the idea because you're taking these legendary characters. So you've taken them, but then you're adding in your own original characters that are kind of interacting in that world with them. And I think that's a really neat idea. So you're not just completely like retelling some of the stories, you're taking those stories and adding in different angles and different people within the stories. I thought that was a really great idea.
Yeah, absolutely. The main characters, two protagonists, they're just a girl and a boy in the first book, although they are a young man and young woman by the end of the series. Ulla and Agen, those are definitely my characters and my creations, although their characteristics and their personalities are very much based upon Finnish culture. But then you're right, interspersed in the book are these famous folk heroes, of Finnish culture, people like Väinämöinen, etc. I didn't want to just retell the Kalevala stories, and I certainly didn't want to, plagiarize even the storyline, so I stayed away from that. And it is a real epic fantasy, but it's set in that world, right? This is like the magical world of Iron Age Finland, circa 800 AD, 900 AD, with all of the creatures and fantasy races and the Finnish magic system, which was based upon song, upon singing, and upon chanting. All of that basically is the world that my characters and my heroes live in.
I'm really kind of disappointed in myself that I didn't, I wasn't aware of this growing up because, I was into Tolkien, I was into the Roman, the Greek gods, and all of that Egyptian, but didn't have this,
Yeah.
and I'm loving it. So the first book, which is the Mark of the Bear Clan, so I've just started
Yeah.
on that one. So I'm just starting on that one,
Right,
and,
right.
and just like Tolkien, what I've noticed is that you're really good with the descriptive. So you're painting the picture, and you can really immerse yourself into the story, and you can do it fairly quickly. So it's just really well done.
I appreciate that. That is something that I always really like in fantasy literature. I think that is one of the main strengths of the world that Tolkien created. Another really traditional fantasy series that a lot of people know is the Earthsea series, Wizard of
Yeah, of course.
Earthsea, the
Yeah.
Ursula K. Le Guin, and she does that too. You kind of you strive to create a patina of realism, so to speak,
Yeah.
and describing the way that the people live. And I've gotten some comments from some fans who have sent me, gone to my website, and they've left
Oh
me
yeah.
messages, and a couple of them commented upon that, and they said something along the lines of, this almost reads like historical fiction.
Yes.
And then all of a sudden, you're kind of snapped back into, wow, but it's a fantasy, because here comes, the Finnish equivalent of an elf, or of another type of magical creature. And I was really pleased when I saw some people commenting upon that, because I strove really, really hard to try to capture that same kind of the feeling, that patina of realism in the world, so to speak, where you could almost forget sometimes maybe it wasn't just straight historical fiction, but it was a fantasy. So I appreciate you mentioning that. And it's something that I really like, and I really was hoping that I could pull that off in the series.
Yeah, yeah, and I think it's so far. I think you've done such a great job with it. Do you do your own website, because it's really well done?
Thank you. But the publisher worked with me on that, and
Yes,
they have their guy. But yeah, it was we collaborated on it together.
I like the little videos for each book. I thought that
Yeah,
was really
yeah.
well done, because it kind of fires you up a little bit to read them. You know, it's like, ooh, yeah, that looks pretty good.
And I thought they captured the feeling really well too.
Yeah,
Just that feeling of Finnish melancholy, and how nature is so incredibly important, in the elements that just always are such a dominating force and factor in that part of the world. So yeah, I like those scenes too.
yeah, yeah. I thought it was really good, and I know it made me want to dive into to the books, but it also brought up probably make a pretty good TV show.
I'm totally down with that. So
Well, you know, sci-fi did Earthsea years ago, and you
yep,
know, there's
yep.
no reason now you've got the Tolkien stuff, you got Wheel of Times out there, you've got all these different fantasy series starting to pop up. I think this could fit right in there. So, I mean, have you
Yeah.
had those thoughts that down the road maybe that's something you could explore?
Yeah, I've had a couple of preliminary conversations with folks. The last book in the trilogy will be coming out probably in the fall, I think, this year,
Yeah,
definitely. So they'll all be
that's
out at
so
that
quick.
point. And yeah, we wanted to do it that way so that people didn't have to wait. And I had written them. Again, I didn't do it one at a time, but I wrote the entire series before I even got
Amazing.
an agent and started shopping around for a publisher. So yeah, maybe that will happen. And I think maybe because of my time in Japan, I also became a big fan of anime and
Yeah,
manga and other Japanese art forms. And I also think that it would lend itself really well to that animated treatment too.
absolutely would.
And so that's something I have in the back of my mind. And who knows? You never know what's going to happen. So
I think there's a lot of possibilities, because with the unique magic system that it has, it could also be a pretty good role playing game.
yeah, yeah, yeah.
Yeah,
So all great ideas.
yeah, there's some possibilities there. So when you did the first book, Mark of the Bear Clan, how was that received in Finland?
Yeah, so that's a great question. I am hoping, and certainly one of my medium-term goals or whatever is to have it translated into Finnish, and
Yeah,
to have a Finnish editions come out. The English language version is available in Finland. I think that most of the feedback that I have gotten has been really positive. I know a lot of Finns, of course, and I still have a lot of friends, and they all really encouraged me. I certainly was very cautious, let's put it this way. As I was writing the book, if you read the foreword to the book and everything, I definitely make sure that I caveat, I'm an American that is doing this, right? I'm
right.
not a native Finn or a native Finnish speaker. This is my love letter to Finland, so to speak. This is
Yeah,
my opportunity, I hope, to write a really cool and engrossing story set in that world, but to definitely do so for people that don't know a lot about that world,
that's right.
for a non-Finnish speaking audience. And I think that Finns understand that. I had to cut corners, in some places with the language, and simplify a few things. And all the feedback I think I've had on that has been really positive. Most Finns with whom I have spoken are really happy to see anybody show and express an interest in this amazing literature that they have,
Yeah,
in this amazing body of folklore, and they think it's just a cool thing that other people are interested in it. I've certainly had a handful of people that are like, "Who do you think you are?" To write this, and I get that. I mean, I have no response, and all I can say is that I did this out of love and respect. And
Yeah.
certainly not out of any kind of appropriation, as it were. But it's been a pretty good reception in general. And again, I think I've got a very good chance of getting the translation after everything is wrapped up on this end, so to speak, and actually pursuing it being printed and published separately in Finland. And what a great thing! I would just be so happy if that happened. It would really just cap off this incredible ride that I've been on the last year or so.
Yeah, it's so great. And I do love the fact that you've already written the books and they're coming out so fast, because that's one disadvantage with fantasy novels is they're usually, they're so complicated, and there's so many characters that if you're waiting sometimes years at a time between books, it can be very difficult to keep up with what you've already read, so you end up a lot of times you have to reread the previous book to get ready for the new book. So I love the fact that you're releasing them kind of close together.
I think that's a cool thing as well. My publisher is a small press, a small publisher, and I think it really works well with that kind of a press too. If you were going with one of the big five or something like that, obviously they have the marketing heft. So you can have 5 years in between books or something, and they're still going to spend $100,000 on a campaign in order to get the book out when the time comes. But for small presses or for indie authors, obviously you can't do that. So I like the strategy, and I think it's nice for readers. It's not going to be so stale in your mind, and you'll still be a little excited about it. And bam, there's the next one, and you can go ahead and start. And I think that's nice too.
It's like watching TV now, where binge watching's kind of the thing now. You can almost do that with the books. They're coming out so fast. You can just boom, 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 whole series.
Yeah. And the fact that I wrote them consecutively obviously lends itself to that. I mean, a lot of people, obviously, maybe most authors, they're writing one book at a time, and then they're trying to market that. And as I mentioned, I did the whole thing about 7 years, and I wrote it all over the world. I wrote it longhand, if you can believe it, in notebooks. I'll
Wow.
never do that again. I'll never do that again. But I did it. I did it, and it was quite an experience.
Yeah, I think that's terrific. So book 2, I'll see if I can get this right. The Heir of Lemminkäinen. Did I get that close?
You came very close. It's Lemminkäinen. So
Lemminkäinen.
Yeah.
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 Very close.
So that's the new one. Book 3 comes out later this year. So in that one, are we seeing, your characters from the first book, are we seeing them a little further down the road? Does the story take up immediately after book 1, or are they a little bit older in book 2?
So yeah, see, it's the latter. You're absolutely right about that. It's a true trilogy, meaning that each book is self-contained,
Yeah.
and there are 7 years that take place more or less between the events of book 1 and 2, and then again between the events of book 2 and 3. So our protagonist, Ulla, the girl with the mark of the clan upon her shoulder,
Yeah.
right? This scar that she gets after being mauled by a bear, and that sets her off down this path of, becoming a shaman, becoming a wizard. She is a teenager, but for that time, 14 or 15 years old, you are basically grown.
Yeah.
And in the second book, she is that age, and Aegon, my double protagonist, is a young man, and then they're both young men and young women in the third volume. So yes, they do grow, they do mature. There are events that transpire, in between the books that are then referred to and that set the stage for each one of these subsequent installments in the series.
Yeah, I love that actually, because it gives you a chance to kind of grow with the characters. You know, you can really become invested with the characters. It's like you're watching them grow up and mature.
It is, absolutely. And they come together only briefly in the first book, actually. But that changes as time goes on. It's funny the different influences you have. I really like Russian literature a lot. And so it's not only other fantasy influences that have made its way into my work, but Anna Karenina is one of my favorite books
Yeah.
by Tolstoy. And I think I've read that 3 times. It's about time for me to read it again. It's been a while. But the structure that he used in there, the two main characters, Anna and the guy Levin, they don't meet for a very long time. You have these two storylines going on. There are a lot of mutual characters that know both of them, and their stories are entwined, but they only come together kind of very briefly, and then their storyline let's go apart. And I actually patterned some of the action in the first book with Ula and with Agen, and the way that their storylines, again, merge and then diverge. That was the that was the inspiration to do that. It was Tolstoy, and it was Anna Karenina. So you never know, what you've read, how it's going to influence you as a writer, and when this idea will pop in your head, and you'll say, that was a really cool thing that this woman or that this man did. Let me see if I can use that technique or that strategy, that conceit, whatever it might be, and use it effectively in my work as well. So it's kind of an interesting part of the writing process.
Yeah, I love that. I love that. So who's your villain? What are they working against
Right.
in
hmm
books?
Exactly. So they're working against Lohi. And Lohi is one of the traditional figures from Finnish folklore and mythology that I have imported, let's say, into my work. And Lohi was basically, for the Finns, she was the personification of winter. So she is
Right.
typically depicted either as a witch, like an old crone type of witch, or sometimes in a very different aspect, like a beautiful image of this beautiful young woman with, alabaster skin, but an expressionless type of face. And I use multiple aspects for her actually throughout the work. She is an extremely powerful being, not a god, but god-like in some ways, and she
Right.
certainly aspires to being seen as such. And this is the antagonist, and when the story begins, after a very long period, Lohi has returned to the far northern land. She is attempting once again to recreate this kingdom, this queenship that she enjoyed at one point, even over the very elements themselves. And this is the battle. This is the clash that Agen and Ula find themselves in, against the Witch of the North. Her realm is Pohjola, and that is just literally translated as Northland.
Yeah.
And you'll see that all over Finland today. That's another word taken straight out of the Kalevala, and it is it's one of the parts of Finnish language, the names of some of the various lands that they travel through, the various kingdoms, the various cities that I wove into the story in different ways.
Yeah, I really like that, and I like the fact that they're fighting against something that seems overwhelming, and it's you've got mortals fighting against beings that are kind of immortal, and it doesn't seem like that's a fair fight. So I'm interested to see how that works and how they're able to kind of survive those trials.
And you'll get to see a little bit more of that as the work goes on. We talk about being inspired by different works, and when you look at different kind of fantasies, so we just talked about two in our discussion today. We talked about Lord of the Rings. We talked about Wizard of Earthsea. I think that Tolkien and Ursula K. Le Guin each had different strategies on how they handle their villains, let's say. So in J.R.R. Tolkien and the Lord of the Rings, Sauron is always a presence, but he's never really seen as an entity until the very
Right.
end, right? There's just that last moment when, the ring is about to be thrown into the fire. He realizes where Frodo is, right? He looks at him, and Tolkien writes in the first person. He's freaking out. Like, he finally realizes what is going on, and he sees the danger that he's in. Ursula K. Le Guin took a different strategy. She has a very impersonalized, type of antagonist, if you want to call it that way. That they appear a little bit woven in and out, but her stories are very much character studies, I think,
Right.
as opposed to being driven by a villain. And what I did in my series, and if you're reading Mark of the Bear Clan right now, at first Lohi really is this presence, so to speak, that is there. She's referred to. She's a little bit of a spiritual presence. Her servants are in different places and interacting with others, but she's a little more remote. And that changes as the series goes on. She is much more of a first person visible character in the second book, The Heir of Lemminkäinen. And she is one of the main characters in terms of presence, let's say, in the final installment. So I did a different take than, say, what Ursula K. Le Guin did, her style, than what J.R.R. Tolkien and so many others have done, where, it's at the very end, you see a glimpse of the great antagonist. I tried to kind of build on it very purposely as we went along,
Yeah.
a little bit in the first book, a little more in the second. And then as we get toward the climax again, she is very much a presence, a real presence, not just that, background spirit of malevolence type of presence by the time you get to the final installment.
Yeah, that's terrific. That's terrific. So what's next? Do you have plans to revisit these characters? Will we see, prequels or things set in that world but with different characters? What's your plan for what's next?
That's a really great question. You're the first person to ask me that of these interviews I've done. So that's great. There are some elements of Finnish folklore, let me put it that way, that I purposely left out and did not weave into this trilogy, so that the possibility was there of doing either of the things that you mentioned, either a prequel kind of dynamic, where again, we'll have Väinämöinen and Lemminkäinen and
Yeah.
Lohi and the traditional characters there, or maybe something that comes afterwards. So I'm not completely committed to that. I actually have a manuscript that I think may be coming out in a couple of years. It is not a fantasy. It's a little bit more of a literary dystopic type of novel,
Okay.
literary fiction. So slightly different genre. But I hope that if the creative process is there for me, and maybe if there's a market for it and some interest in it, I think the Far Northern Land Saga, yeah, maybe could see some additional episodes, some additional chapters at some point.
Yeah, it just seems like a fantasy world that it's very large and there's a lot of stories that could be told. So, you could probably write as much or as little as you would want to in that world.
Yeah, I really did concentrate on the world building, obviously,
Yeah. Yeah.
and you're right about that. It's a big world, and it has a lot of backstory and a lot of history to it, and there are other tales and other chapters woven into it that yeah, that are out there.
Yeah, for sure. So tell me a little bit about your writing style. When you were working on these books, do you have volumes, notebooks full of notes and research and all of that set up, or did you just sit down and it just started pouring out?
Yeah, I think I started off doing the latter, and the first few chapters I did indeed write that way, and I didn't know exactly where I was going. But subsequent to that, I did an awful lot of research. And most of that was having to do with, well, some of it was based upon the mythology and the folklore, and making sure that I had, that right, and then deciding what elements I wanted to use. And some of that was that patina of realism I talked about. So I studied, for example, slash and burn agriculture, and what that was,
Yeah.
what that meant. This is how the people at that time grew crops. They would, cut down trees, basically burn them, because the burning process creates the nutrients,
Right.
and then they would grow rye. But you can only do that once or twice, and then you have to move on, to another area, because it uses up the fertility of the soil very quickly. That's one example of some of the stuff that I researched, so that I could then weave that into the descriptions of the villagers, the
Yeah.
villages, how they lived, what they ate, how they fished, how they worked. And I did indeed have notebooks filled with that type of stuff that I was referring to then as I was going through, some of these subsequent chapters, in order to flesh it out and try to create that, this is a real place and a real world, and these are real people, and this is how they actually lived.
Yeah, I think that's really interesting. And I like the historical part of that. Did you, what kind of issues did you run into when you were writing? Like, did you have an ending already kind of sketched out, or did that develop as you were writing?
So I had the ending already in mind for the first book. I did not have the ending for the series, however, and it took me quite a long time to come up with that. I was very deep into the second book before I had one of those moments when I was like, "That's it! Finally, I know
Yeah.
what is going to happen." And that was really bothering me for a certain period of time as I was getting deeper and deeper into it. But I think I'm also one of these writers where I would have ideas. I don't want to use visions in the sense of, a literal vision, but, visions of vignettes of certain
Right.
things that I wanted. So, for example, in the second book, The Heir of Lemminkäinen, there is a scene where Wainamoinen, the great wizard, right? Ulla, our protagonist, and another girl about her age named Sitsa, who was only introduced in the second book. They are on horseback and they ride into a market square where three men have just been hung, and they're dead. They've been executed for whatever it is that they did. And Wainamoinen enters into kind of this philosophical discussion, basically over capital punishment, you might say, right? Over
Yeah.
vengeance and revenge and the taking of a life in order to exercise some kind of justice. Is that really justice? I had that image in my mind, and kind of that philosophical discussion, so to speak, over that issue, long before I ever got to that point of the book or even knew how that would fit in. And I actually wrote a short version of that chapter, again, having no idea whatsoever how that might fit into the story. Let's say 4 years before I ever got
Wow.
to that point in the writing. And then I found a way in order to incorporate that. And I would say there are about 5 or 6 scenes throughout the series like that I wrote sometimes years in advance, and then subsequently adapted the story in order to find a way to accommodate that. So that was my style. I did have an outline. I kind of knew where I was going. I did take some detours, but I had these ideas for certain scenes and things I wanted to do well in advance. And I would work and find a way at some point to get that in, to make it make sense,
Yeah.
and to try to make it the strongest scene possible. And I actually think those are the strongest scenes, in the entire series, the ones that I had been inspired to do,
Yeah.
just upon the characters without knowing how that was going to fit into the whole. They're some of my favorite ones, actually.
Yeah. I think that's really terrific that you were able to have that foresight So and sometimes years in advance where you've kind of, thank goodness you jotted some of that down so that you were able to incorporate that later. I think that's really good.
Yeah.
You've been in so many different places around the world. Do you speak multiple languages?
I do. I think I'm one of these people where I typically have, in addition to English, one other language that is active at any point in time. But some of the others that I've studied are still there. I've learned in my course of being a foreign service officer and studying languages that you never know which ones are going to stick and which ones are not. For some reason, Finnish stuck with me. I don't know why. It's a very difficult language, and certainly I really had to apply myself. I studied it for about 1 year, but I was a fairly decent Finnish speaker for an American, let's say, for a non-native speaker, and that is still there. And I can still go online, to a Finnish newspaper or something, and let's say if it's an article about something that I know, Ukraine and the war, let's say, I can still read it to this day without having to refer to a dictionary. On the other hand, Japanese, I studied that for 2 years. And it was a bridge too far. I did not do as well in Japanese as I have in other languages, and that was a real challenge for me. The kanji was very difficult for me to acquire. I had not studied it when I was young, and I think I hate to say it, but being in your 40s and studying kanji for the first time is maybe not the wisest thing to do. And I speak Spanish. I spoke Portuguese. That is still back there. My wife is Romanian, and so we can speak Romanian, and I can understand most of what she's saying. Not everything, but most of what. So when she's talking about me, probably with the kids, I can get a little bit of it. I'm like, hey, wait a minute, what's going on there? But it is it's a fascinating process. And it's a big part of the books. You kind of noticed that earlier. I didn't want it to be overwhelming, but there's a lot of Finnish in the series. Place names and the names of the 7 clans of the far northern land. And when Vainamoinen is using magic incantations or words as part of spells, I put many of that in Finnish. And just a real quick anecdote, one thing that I did that I was able to do with the help of one of my language teachers who worked with me is that we took all the Finnish names that are used and we antiqued them, meaning that we put them in a form that would have been a very old archaic form. So, you're not going to notice that. An English, speaker is not going to notice that, but the Finns do notice that. And indeed, several people have commented upon that. To get back to your question about, what do Finns think about it? We tried to come up with, both for place names and for the personal names, when they were actual Finnish names. These are antiqued, archaic sounding names that would have been more like 12th century or 13th century versions of what they have subsequently become. So language was a big part of it, and it's a big part of being a foreign service officer. It's a window into culture. It is a window into the psyche and the art and the politics of any country or any people. And even if you study a language and you don't speak it very well, simply the process of studying it is going to give you an insight that is very, very difficult to obtain in any other way. So I think it's really important as a foreign service officer, and that has paid dividends for me as a writer. Then I think the slightly better bit of insight that I have gained spending so much time working with some of these languages.
Yeah, I really do love that, and I'm sure that for the Finnish, that has to help how they feel about the series, in that you obviously took the time to put those older sounding names and spellings in there. I think that's terrific. I mean, that's commendable that you actually did the extra step and put that. It's almost like an Easter egg for Finland.
Yeah, right. Yeah.
Yeah, that's really great. Well, David, thank you so much. This is I'm so excited about this series. I'm all in, so I'm ready. So I want to finish up book 2 before you get book 3 out.
Absolutely. That sounds great. No, I had a great time chatting with you, and I really appreciate the opportunity. Had a lot of fun.
Yeah, me too. Me too. What do you have a name for the 3rd book yet?
Yes, it is. It's the Queen of Pohjola. So I mentioned that name earlier. That is the Louhi's domain, the Queen of the North, the Queen of Pohjola.
Yeah, that's exciting. That should be out later in the year.
Absolutely.
Yeah. Okay, David, thank you so much. Yeah, you'll have to come back when the 3rd book comes out. You'll have to come back. We'll talk again.
Absolutely. I'd love to.
Yeah. Okay. Hold on one second. How fun of an interview was that? So that was author David Allen Schlaefer. Hopefully I'm getting that. You know how I struggle with names. So hopefully I'm getting that correct. But he was just terrific. What a world builder. You know, I'm such a fantasy lover. Robert Jordan was probably my favorite. Brandon Sanderson is so talented as well, and of course George Martin, even with the struggles to finish his series, just a wonderful writer. I think this series has the potential to build that type of world. He mentioned the Earthsea books; those are terrific as well. Do yourself a favor and check these out. So the first book in the Far Northern Land Saga is The Mark of the Bear Clan. So do yourself a favor and check that one out. And the great part about it is by the end of the year, the whole trilogy is going to be out. That's amazing. That's amazing and prolific. So good for David. And thank you guys so much for tuning in. I love, we have such a terrific array of guests, and we have so many wonderful actors and directors and producers. But I love the interviews with the authors. You know, at heart, I'm a book lover, and I love when I get a chance to speak to an author, a writer. It's just terrific. Thank you guys so much for tuning in to us again this week. Definitely don't take that for granted. If you haven't done so yet, we would really appreciate if you'd help us out with our YouTube channel, MeisterCon Pod, and subscribe. That would just be the best. You can find all 360 or so episodes, audio and video, on our website, meistercon.com. If we're doing anything in studio, if we're going on location, if we're going and covering a convention, all that will be on the website, meistercon.com. So thank you guys so much. Until next time, bye, everybody.